It's an epic film. It's a page out of the history of the development of our country.
Everything that happened in the country happened in New York first.
I didn't know about the gang culture of the time at all.
It was surprising how Dickensian and it's almost medieval with the dirt roads and so dilapidated, really startling.
At that time, it was literally like wooden shacks and two-story buildings, and in the Five Points especially, particularly, it was such an ultra-violent sort of world.
The young boy comes back from the House of Reform, sent away for 15 years, and wants to kill Bill the Butcher for killing his father in an earlier gang war. It's very tribal, very primitive, but that revenge drives him and drives the story. In terms of finding revenge, getting the revenge on Bill the Butcher, he has to gain the Butcher's trust.
It becomes a little more incestuous, where, you know, this relationship that I have with Bill, I can't help but admire his life and who he is and the way he conducts himself. And there's a certain affinity that I have for him. So it's a much more complex revenge story than just me chasing him for the entire film. We actually become friends, and it becomes this relationship where he almost becomes like a father figure to me.
He didn't count on one thing, and that is his heart. He didn't count on the feelings he'd have for Bill and also for Jenny Everdeen, whom he met. Jenny's an interesting character because she represents part of his digression, part of his realization of his feelings, his emotion, his feelings of love.
Basically, all three characters in the movie, Amsterdam, Jenny, and Bill the Butcher, are pretty much composite characters. I represent sort of the new world that's coming in, sort of hordes of immigrants that were coming in at the time. And he's a pluralistic character. He's somebody that represents the new world and what America was to become. Whereas Bill the Butcher, he's a nativist, and he represents the old world, and you know, he wanted to keep the power amongst the people that he felt built the country.
Bill, even though you can understand his conviction, you don't agree with his conviction, you don't agree with his racist points of view, but you understand how he could feel that way, how he thinks he sees things.
People were more inclined to stick within their own communities because they felt strength in that.
They didn't come over to become Americans. They came over being Irish people in America. So they stayed in these tight-knit groups and gangs. Most of them didn't want to stay there. They just wanted to make enough money to go back.
I literally knew nothing about this world and how significant and important it is in our history, and it's in none of the history books that I ever read as a young man.
The draft riots themselves are not one of the greatest moments in American history that way, but...
it's sort of swept under the rug. Yeah. But I related to it in the sense that, you know, at the end of the day, it boils down to territory. And what's so interesting is, I mean, these are the origins of gangs in America. These people wore their colors, they had their outfits, you know, trying to represent who they were and stake their territory, but all trying to fiercely remain individual.
I suppose for all of us that we weren't kids, but we were just starting out when Mean Streets first appeared in Britain, where I was living at the time. It was really like a light went on. Taxi Driver, we saw time and again, Raging Bull, New York, all of them. That was our discovery of this place through Martin's eyes. It amazed us.
I can't be so presumptuous to think what Mr. Scorsese is thinking about his films, but he's made some other films about New York, Age of Innocence, Goodfellas, and in a way this is sort of in my mind anyway, a prequel to some of those stories.
I've been luckily making pretty much the pictures I wanted to make, but there was always one picture I really had in mind was Gangs of New York, a film set in that period, in that place and time, of dealing with the history of New York and dealing with all these extraordinary characters that were around at the time.
It was a project that he'd been wanting to do for over 20 years, and it never happened. All the pieces didn't come together in the puzzle, and finally we got it financed, and he was ready to go, and I was overjoyed.
Getting offered the job is one of the great excitements. Like actors, you know, that you have various jokes. Like so if that's Scorsese on the phone, I don't tell him I'm busy or something. And then when it really happens, it's really exciting.
It was a wonderful group of people. Obviously, you know, being able to work with Mr. Day-Lewis, who is, you know, such a, you know, inspiration to so many young actors, who's somebody that's so committed to his roles and his characters, was a huge thrill for me, and I know he does an unbelievable job in the characters, one of the more menacing, treacherous characters ever on film.
He didn't act. He literally became Bill the Butcher.
Leo's a fine actor. I think for a lot of people, they'll be quite astonished to see the transformation he's made.
Every time I mention to people that I'm shooting this Martin Scorsese film called The Gangs of New York in Italy, they get this startled expression like, why would you shoot The Gangs of New York in Italy? As soon as I got here, I realized why, because they built this whole town with 2 ships in a harbor and this whole main street.
Well, we'd all heard rumors about what Dante was up to, who became like the wizard of the 5 points. But to actually see it with one's own eyes, it was quite astonishing.
It was like stepping back into time.
Everything looks like it's had a life, that it's been around for so many years. It's pretty amazing.
Dante Ferretti did an incredible job in every little detail. It's not only a good movie, it's a lesson in history.
I'm fascinated by history, and I'm fascinated by the history of America and also the history of the city.
I literally knew nothing about this world and how significant and important it is in our history, and it's in none of the history books that I ever read as a young man.
So many aspects of the city's history that I didn't know about, nobody knew about. The great revelation was reading Herbert Asbury's Gangs of New York. Nobody had heard of the draft riots that I knew of. A major event in the city's history, certainly one of the biggest riots in American history, and apparently shoved under the rug. Manhattan was urban up to maybe somewhere in the 40s, maybe the 50s. And then north of that, you have farmland. Down below, you have the rich concentrated right in the middle of the city, along Fifth Avenue, because money went north and it went inland, as far from the waterfront as possible, because the waterfront was dangerous and smelly and all that kind of stuff. The immigrants, which were Irish and German, were toward the east. The Irish south, the Germans north. The Germans were always more settled and more prosperous than the Irish. What the city looked like was brick buildings, generally for the rich, and townhouses. The poor mostly lived in frame houses, rather tumble-down frame houses, some of which were pretty old. And they got kind of added on to endlessly. And barns and stables became converted for human use. And humans were living side by side with animals. Animals were running around the streets in the third and fourth decades of the 19th century because of the famine in Ireland. The Irish came in huge numbers. They fled Ireland in droves. And why did they come to New York? Well, they went just about everywhere, but New York was the biggest and most available and closest port. If you draw a straight line west from Ireland, it's New York and Boston were the easiest places to reach.
I think that first great influx of immigration from Ireland was the first great test of what America's supposed to be. This bring us your homeless and your poverty-stricken and those who are oppressed, etc., come to our country and become a citizen and work with us. But there were so many, so fast, and for such a prolonged period of time that it created that who has the right to be here situation, which is something that we deal with every day, I think, in America.
They said there were more Irish during that point in history than there were in America than there were in all of Ireland. They were basically perceived as the lowest of the low. You've got to see the caricatures of how they portrayed Irish people, almost like these beasts that couldn't even speak. They were constantly drunk and mindless.
One of the reasons they reacted against the Irish, of course, was that they didn't speak English, didn't have trades, for the most part. I'm just generalizing now. But most importantly, they were Catholic. This is a period of time where they're still fighting to preserve a country that had a separation of church and state. The racism of the time was astounding. And don't forget, we're dealing with the Civil War, too.
The rivalries had a lot to do with ethnic identity. These native gangs were identified with the Bowery, and the Irish gangs were further east into the 5 Points. And neighborhood turf was absolutely everything for the gang members. And I think probably a good guess for the average age of a gang member was probably about 16 or 17, probably down to as low as 12.
I mean, they did every possible thing that you could do.
Yeah.
At the time, the corruption was unbelievable when you really get into the history of it.
It was a time when the line between criminal and hero and decent human being and not so decent human being were very muddy and murky.
Violence has always been a part of all urban settings everywhere. In particular, if they were port cities, which New York emphatically was. Violence is part of the fabric of New York, has been from the very beginning, and you can translate this to any port in the world.
You have to remember the country had sort of come into being around 1789, I think, and it was 1860, and the place was being torn apart by war. So, in effect, it was still being tested as a country and still being formed as a country. And there are other issues with the politics, because a lot of it's very corrupt, personified by William Tweed character, who later became the famous Boss Tweed, who is the name now. Whenever they mention corruption in America, everybody knows Boss Tweed.
He was really the most corrupt politician ever, really. I mean, he was ripping off hundreds of millions of dollars, literally, even then. Just ruthless. He set the pattern for corrupt politicians, I think.
Boss Tweed, William Marcy Tweed, was himself of Irish stock and grew up in an East Side tenement. Came up through the ranks and was in one of the leading lights, if not the leading light, of Tammany Hall. He pulled the strings. He controlled the gangs to the degree that the gangs were an unofficial arm of enforcement. The gangs were not officially on the city payroll, but certainly some of the gangs functioned as if they effectively were on the city payroll, and they worked for whoever happened to be wielding the most power. That's how gangs operate. You know, besides protecting themselves and their turf, they are available for hire to whoever holds the club. And since Tweed did, he effectively controlled the gangs. Bill the Butcher was a butcher and a brawler and a gang member. He ran a fire company, the Red Rover. There was not one centralized fire department at the time. It was a collection of voluntary companies. Gangs would have a link to a fire company. A fire company would kind of own gangs, etc. And there were, at any given point, up to maybe 30 or 40 of these companies. One detail you see in the movie is the man sitting on the barrel covering the fire hydrant to hide it from the rival companies. Yes, rival companies would have fights over who got to put out the building, and there was obviously looting involved. There was a financial interest. The state set up the Metropolitan Police Force, and for a while you had these two competing police departments fighting each other, releasing each other's prisoners. The city was chaos. Criminals operated with absolute impunity because they knew that if they were arrested by one set of cops, the other set of cops would set them free. So it was just anarchy. The events of that time and place through several distorting lenses. You cannot trust the press of the 19th century on any of these things. Newspapers might have reported deaths because they wanted to make some editorial color. That doesn't mean people actually died. They were sort of impervious to libel suits, so they'd just dispense a lot of scandal. And they were the ones that gave out a lot of the crime stories, but they were often very circumspect. So they could tell you it happened such and such a street, but to a gentleman and a lady, but they wouldn't tell you the names and wouldn't tell you the date because they didn't really know and they might have made it up. There was something like 20 daily newspapers in New York. The New York Times was not, the famous newspaper of record we think of it as being now. There was one of many daily newspapers. You have a lot of kind of fly-by-night little sheets that came out more regularly, that might only live for a couple of months. Police Gazette just increased in importance. It's already fairly important by the 1860s, but gets hugely important toward the latter half of the 19th century, which was the kind of sporting men's sheet. It was the one that would tell you about boxing, would tell you about politics, would tell you about plays, especially plays in which young women wore body stockings. And this was read not only in New York City, but eventually in every barbershop in the United States. And so a lot of this Bowery culture was broadcast and made famous around the country by the Police Gazette. The people of the 5 Points went to the theater where they saw melodramas. Generally, melodramas were very big. Shakespeare, Shakespeare was eternal, and it was a kind of maybe slowly, action-packed, dumbed-down Shakespeare, but it was Shakespeare. Violence has always been a big draw. Various animals were baited for sport. There were, of course, Kit Burns' rat pit, but there were a lot of institutions like it. Bear baiting pits. There were cockfights. There were illegal boxing matches between humans. They drank, they danced, they sang. People sang much more in the past than they do today. I mean, that is just regular people singing for and with each other. Lots of street musicians, hurdy-gurdy players, organ grinders with monkeys. The minstrel show began in New York City right around this time, actually. In the 1850s is when Dan Emmett and his company started in a hotel downtown, and he's responsible for the song Dixie. So think of that. The song Dixie, so important in the Civil War, comes from New York City. New Yorkers tend to not to know about this stuff for a couple of reasons, really. I mean, there's some obvious ones. There's, you know, American historical amnesia. Everybody knows about that. Documentary photography was unknown. I mean, pretty much. Photographers made their money by taking portraits of the rich and famous. They were not going to risk their equipment by taking them into the poor quarters. And then there's a kind of civic protectionism where you want to talk about the nice stuff. You want to talk about the Vanderbilts, but you don't want to talk about the poor people and their fights. Gangs of New York connects to the history of New York played out in Mr. Scorsese's movies in ways that are, you know, very clear. What we're seeing is the ancestry of the kind of street culture you see in Mean Streets, and the street culture that informs Raging Bull, and the whole panoramic mafia story of Goodfellas. He's obviously fascinated by the social fabric, what holds it together, how it operates in the world, how, you know, how connected people in apparently disparate segments of society are truly, and how life, how history is made by the semi-accidental workings of people in all these different levels.
I met Marty first time here in Cinecittà when I was with Fellini for City of Women. And then he called me for The Last Temptation, but I was busy with Baron Munchausen. And then he called me again for Age of Innocence. And Age of Innocence was my first movie with Martin. Then I did Casino, Kundun, I did set and costume, and then Bringing Out the Dead, and now this. But I heard about this movie just when I did Age of Innocence. When we start to talk about this movie, he gave to me 5 books full of researches. And then I make sketches, big sketches with all the information I have. And then I make technical drawings, and then I make models. Because with the models, you see three-dimensional. You have the right feeling what you're going to build. And then also it's easy for the director when it's the model, he figure out better what he want to shoot in. Sometimes it's better also for me because I don't want to build something you don't need. And then I showed all this to Marty. Marty approved this, and then I started.
Well, I think it was very important for us because the actors, when they get there, it's a real place. Sets of this size, maybe the last you'll ever see in a film. The exterior was the whole area of downtown New York.
I start to build the set here in middle of April, and we start to shoot September 18. So we build everything in 5 months. So we build all the Paradise Square, all the interiors in the stage 5, the brewery, the Saturn Circus, and the pagoda, the Spiral Pagoda. And at the same time, we build also the harbor with the 2 ships and all the interiors in the back lot. And then we build a section of Broadway. I have had fantastic people with me, all the carpenter, painters, plasters, sculptors. We have had fantastic people.
Well, we'd all heard the rumors about what Dante was up to, who became like the wizard of the 5 points through conversations with Martin and others that had been over to Cinecittà to see what was going on there. It had already taken on a kind of mythological status, but nonetheless, to actually see it with one's own eyes, it was quite astonishing.
In terms of images and in terms of the scale of it, it's the most exciting because it has so much to offer. And we're treating his sets like we're shooting on location. We can photograph like almost everything in every direction. It's all like 360.
The sets, firstly, are fantastic. Dante Ferretti, you know, it's got a very Italian flair. I think the whole movie has got a very extravagant look to it. The sets, for me, are wonderful because there's a lot of scale and scope and largeness to them. So we're dealing with big strokes all the time in the movie, in as much as lots of actors, lots of stuntmen, lots of crowd. So it's fun dealing with large entities rather than, you know, two people fighting in a train carriage, which is exciting in its own way, but this is a totally different view. And I think the sets, street here, Broadway, the scope and the width of Broadway is a great sort of set to play with. You know, I've had Cameron Diaz coming down here with a building behind me on fire, big screen looking stuff. It's got a very, very old world expense and expanse to it, I think. This certainly has got a big budget look and feel to it, which is wonderful to play with.
The whole city created, isn't it? It's downtown New York, it's there. I mean, wherever you go around the corner, you go further, go down to the dock, come back, past the warehouses. I mean, it's extraordinary. You don't have to suspend your disbelief for very long.
Anywhere you look on that set, you can't imagine that it's something that was created a couple of months before. The aging, the timelessness of the piece itself, and then it transports you completely back in time, and you're looking at it and you're going, wait a second, I'm confused here at what I'm seeing, because it seems so real, but at the same time, it can't be real. It was literally, and I'm sure everyone will say that it was like stepping back into time.
Every corner of every place you looked was the city at the time, and New York had to be recreated there because
it's no more.
It's not the same New York. You know, there's skyscrapers now and buildings now. At that time, it was literally like wooden shacks and two-story buildings and pigs running in the streets.
I was bowled over, and still am, by the set. It's astonishing. I love even still just wandering about the set and looking at the places and picturing individual histories in that place.
The Chinese pagoda had this amazing candle chandelier with probably a couple hundred candles on it, and they had to light it every time before they took it up. It takes like 20 guys to light it. And it was so beautiful, it was so rich.
The whole set just evoked this period, and you just got a sense of the scale of New York in those days and just how precarious life was too. I mean, these buildings were essentially wooden shacks, and people lived in them and lived underneath them, and like a rabbit warren.
Because when you work on location, even if the spirit of the place where you are, the building or the fields, it's always imbued with some kind of spirit there. And even in conflict, you can find a way of using that. In a studio, there is nothing, unless you're interested in the ghosts of other movies, which obviously we're not. So you begin with nothing. You build these sets, you try and create a world, but there's no inherent life in those places. And what Dante managed to do was to provide us with everything that we needed to feel at home, you know, to make a home for ourselves, because that's all it is. You make a home. Everyone has to make their home. In my case, it was Satan's Circus and the 5 Points. And I really grew to love those places.
Every time I mention to people that I'm shooting this Martin Scorsese film called The Gangs of New York in Italy, they get this startled expression like, why would you shoot The Gangs of New York in Italy? And as soon as I got here, I realized why, because they built this whole town with 2 ships in a harbor and, you know, this whole main street. Makes my job really easy, actually. You walk around and it's like, I don't have to imagine anything, I'm here. I mean, every detail is accounted for.
That section of old New York was built so that if we wanted to do a scene inside Satan's Circus, let's say, which was Bill the Butcher's place, and we wanted to change it to the barbershop, which were Monk McGinn, that was his place, played by Brendan Gleeson, it was all ready to go. And people would say, oh, Marty, you spent almost a year in Rome, pre-production and shooting. Oh, it must have been great. I said, no, I was in New York. I was at the 5 Points. I don't know about you guys.
People ask, did you learn any Italian? I'm like, no, I was in New York.
I keep remembering John Lennon's line about, you know, he was asked why he lived in New York, and he said, well, if he'd been born in Roman times, he would have lived in Rome. And here we are in New York and Rome. I mean, how good is that?
Now, the costumes are very important because it was a very colorful period, particularly of the underworld. And I think we have many records of what the upper classes and what the middle classes wore, but only few of the lower classes in the criminal world or the underworld.
Like any period film, the first stage is looking at the actual period, looking at things from the real period. So that was from 1840 to 1860. And you look at paintings from the period, but luckily for us with this, the daguerreotype had been invented, so we had photography to look at and looked at lots and lots of photographs. Also, Marty's company had already done like years worth of research. So I had a good start. They sent me a whole package and a lot of reading material, a lot of stuff to look at. So I had a good start, and that's where I began.
Designers tend to be very faithful to the historical aspect of costumes. She manages to do both. She manages to be faithful to the historical side and at the same time give it the flair that it needs. And that is her genius.
A lot of what we've done isn't strictly historically correct. I mean, we went through various stages, and it does end up getting fairly stylized as well, although all being based with historical accuracy. I then taken it a few steps further.
Sandy came up with different ideas, a certain kind of hat, a certain way of walking, the shirt tails. We sort of elaborated on the shirts being outside the pants, making them longer than they would have been in reality. So that we've heightened the fantasy of the place.
I don't start with a drawing and then say, let's find the fabric that will work for this costume and this is the shape I want. I start with the fabrics. So that's probably the most important thing to me, is to be surrounded by fabrics that I like and inspire me, and that's usually where it starts. And the drawings are something I do quite a long way down the line. I mean, I do them, and I do little scribble drawings for the people making the costumes, which are more diagrams.
Well, I had worked with Sandy on a number of occasions before, Michael Collins, Rob Roy, and so I know the way she works, and I know she's an extraordinary talent. I felt this coat they made for me, this huge, big, long coat, I felt should be on my character at all times. I think he'd be naked without it. Anytime he left his warren, this coat would be on. Almost like an armor, and it designated who he was, even from a distance. If you saw that coat, you'd know who the character was.
In a period film like this, a designer has a far greater responsibility in some ways. Also, the collaboration that they can have with each individual actor it's necessary, but at the same time, they have to take a lot of that responsibility themselves. They can't go out shopping with you.
Marty had quite strong ideas of how he saw Bill the Butcher, and he wanted him as a dandy, sort of showing off, really, sartorially, showing off his wealth in his clothing. So I started coming up with a few ideas and met Daniel, who initially had different ideas about where his character was coming from. But again, we tried on some shapes that we'd come up with, and it worked.
I'd never really imagined myself, Bill, or the natives to have been such peacocks. But from the moment that I began to try these things that she'd invented, that they seemed quite right and wonderful.
Bill's outfits with all these different plaids and color just sort of clashing together, and everything was so rich.
We sort of developed a look with Daniel which kind of accentuated his longness, and he's very lean, and we accentuated that by making everything fairly tight-fitting and sort of very long, narrow trousers. And that's how he starts the movie looking kind of strange, actually, quite spidery. So the first time we see him, he's dressed for battle, for the opening battle sequence, which is a bit of a strange look. I mean, there is the full-length coat, which has always been in the script, so I know how to do that. And that was actually one of the first things we made.
Then they have to become clothes. I mean, that's the tough thing. With something as extreme as that, it takes a little more time to get used to it.
Yeah, the women were the most difficult to do to begin with, because you look at pictures of Victorian women, and it's what everyone knows a Victorian woman looks like, with heavily corseted, huge crinolines if they're rich. Full length, fairly staid looking, and we had to think, how could we make the women of this made up world go with the men? Because Marty wanted girls in the gangs as well. So I wanted to make them look a little tougher, and started again looking through reference and found some images of women who actually wore trousers underneath their skirts, and they were a group of women in the 1850s, I think, who were called dress reformers. And they were sort of like, early day feminists. And they were cutting up their long dresses, making the bottom bits into trousers and wearing them underneath their skirts. And we sort of used that. I used that as inspiration.
My character, she wasn't formal. You know, we think also of women being corseted up and these big, huge, you know, billowing skirts that weighed 30, 40 pounds. Sandy's, she just took that all away from the 5 points. She said, that doesn't exist here. Women don't have the money for that. And you think about it, you go, oh yeah, women wouldn't have the money for it, you know, to build a complete structure around their body.
There is a range within this film because apart from things like the dead rabbit, the Native Americans, we've got people who live in the brewery who are slum dwellers, like really, really low, raggy looking people. We've got politicians and smart people who, along the lines of Boss Twee, but then we also had things like the Chinese pagoda scene with Chinese opera, so that went completely off on another tangent. We had to do costumes for the Bowery Theatre for the play, Uncle Tom's Cabin, so there's been a huge range actually. One of the great things about working with Marty is that he understands clothes and costumes and loves clothes. It makes it much easier to work with a director who understands what you're talking about, and he's got the most fantastic memories. So if you show him something, he'll remember it. I mean, I was really impressed when I would show him reference pictures, and he could actually tell the difference between one year and the next. You know, he'll go, oh yeah, that sleeve's a 1857 sleeve, and that's the sort of after 1860. It's quite incredible.
We had the idea that the gangs themselves, there were so many gangs down there, the colors they would wear, that they'd be able to see, one gang member be able to see another gang member coming down the street, and he or she would know who they were and who they're affiliated with. For example, in the case of the dead rabbits, we knew that through research that they used red stripes. In some cases just down the side of the pants, another case across the shirt. Sandy Powell came up with the idea of doing the red stripes in a primitive way, doing it themselves with paint on whatever shirts they had available as a symbol. The Bowery Boys, much more elegant. They had stovepipe hats, red fire shirts, black frock coats, check pants or plaid pants, and long boots. And so and what they called soap locks. Their hair was matted down in a special kind of shiny, almost like what they used to call patent leather hair.
These people who have nothing, we think of dark and dreary and drab, and if there's one thing that these people could have is color. It doesn't cost anything. Color is the wealth of these people. It's at a time, too, where there's a richness of cultures emerging together.
The difficult thing was just producing the amount of costumes that we had to cope with the numbers of people. You know, it's phenomenally huge.
We alone, I think, have made something like 3,000 different costumes in our actual workshop, because that has also been the main factor, building things from scratch. And I'd say we have something like 7,000 costumes altogether.